in algebra, we'll come to learn about solving many type of equations, and the process we use to solve a particular equation depends on the type of equation that we're dealing with. In the previous section, we learned about